I'll either answer them directly myself or I'll pass them on to Darren. I'll also put the handout in the chat a couple times throughout the class, so you can save that. And other than that, let's let Darren get started.
Okay, so today we're going to learn about steeking and why it's not really so scary. But maybe the first thing you're wondering is why it would even be necessary to steek or cut your work, your knitted work. So this is a sweater that I made, and this is a stranded, it's not really Fair Isle, it's a stranded knitted sweater in an Icelandic style. And this color work is so much easier to do if you're only working on the right side of the work. If you have to turn it and do color work on the wrong side, as you can see, the floats block the work that you've done, so it makes it very hard to follow the chart. So if you knit a sweater like this in the round, then as you're knitting in the round, you're only working on the front of your work, so you don't ever have to turn it to the back. So that's why it's nice to be able to do Fair Isle sweaters or stranded knitted sweaters in the round. But you might not want a pullover sweater. You might want to cut it open and turn it into a cardigan. And so that's what I did with this one. I cut it open and then I added this wide button band and turned it into a cardigan because I get so hot. If I tried to wear a sweater out of this is very heavy wool, be very hard to wear it. So, and then in this one, I have an example. This sweater was a store-bought sweater, and I did needle felting designs on it. But what I did first was I cut it open, and then I added this felted button band. So it's just a store-bought sweater. There was no preparation in advance. And then I did some needle felting designs. And I think we have a needle felting class coming up where we're going to do some needle felting. So you can steek a sweater that you've already made, or that maybe you've purchased a sweater and you'd like to turn it into a cardigan. So it's really not that hard, and it's really not that scary. So maybe let's change the view to my hands. Let's see if I can get this camera right. Okay, so the first type of steek that I want to talk about, the steek preparation, because you can't just cut your work willy-nilly, because if you just cut it without any forethought, then you're going to run into problems. It could very well unravel. But steeking was originally done in the Shetland Islands of Scotland. And the wool that they use, the Shetland wool, is quite fuzzy, and it has a lot of fur, a lot of hair, and a lot of fuzzy bits. And that helps to keep the knitting from unraveling. So this little swatch that I made here is not made from Shetland wool. I don't have any Shetland wool, but this is a mohair, and it's very fuzzy. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to cut your work without any worries. So this steeking preparation is no preparation. So it's pretty much the easiest one. You want to determine where you're going to cut. So I'm going to follow this line right up here and just cut it, following that straight line. And because it's such a small swatch, I don't have to mark where I'm cutting. So as you can see, when you cut your knitted fabric apart, it doesn't automatically start unraveling immediately. So people tend to think and feel knitted fabric is kind of spring-loaded. And if you cut it or you drop a stitch, automatically it's just going to start unraveling, and just like a spring-loaded toy or something. But and with this, because it's so fuzzy, you can even fuss with it a little bit. I wouldn't recommend it. It is starting to unravel right here a little bit. What I recommend immediately when you steek it is the next thing you're going to do is fold it over and sew that down with a felling stitch. So you can use a whip stitch. If it's not too bulky, you can fold it so that that raw seam is concealed. If you're using very thick yarn, it's going to give you a very thick edge. So you don't even have to do that. You can just fold it over and then just whip stitch that down, and it'll never unravel. And if you don't want to see that raw edge, you can put a piece of the grosgrain ribbon or something over that and sew that down. And that'll help conceal your edge. And then after you do that, you can go along here, and I'm going to demonstrate this on a different swatch, but you can go along here on this edge and pick up stitches. And so you pick up stitches on the edge, and then you can either knit a button band or not. If you don't want to have a button band, once you sew this down, you could put a zipper in it, or you could put some little eye hooks to just close it like that, so that it doesn't overlap, so that the edges are just kind of kissing if they're just with the little eye hooks. Or you could put a zipper, or you could put a button band. And you can also knit a separate button band and then sew it on, which is sometimes a little easier, because when you pick up stitches for a button band, you run the risk of it puckering a little bit. So lots of different ways to do that. We're not really talking about that today, so just so you know about that. And so I knitted this swatch here, and I've marked out a few places. I've kind of got a little head start so that I could demonstrate things without taking up too much time. My favorite way of steeking is, I like the felted steek. I like to, and I've only ever heard one other person do it this way. When I was researching for this class and watching some other people and different techniques, somebody mentioned this way, and that's the first time I've ever heard of it. So for needle felting, you want to use a brush like this, or you can use a piece of foam, or like a piece of upholstery foam, or even styrofoam for something that's quick like this. You're not going to be using very much. And you want to put that on the inside of your sweater or whatever it is you're going to steek. Now, what you want to make sure, though, is that you're not putting it underneath by mistake, because you don't want to end up cutting the back piece. You're not really cutting it in half. So make sure you're putting your brush on the inside of your work, right under where you want to steek. And what I've done was, I'm going to steek this line right here. And so I've marked that line with, I did just a quick basting stitch just to mark the line that I'm going to cut. That's not going to be really part of it. And when I knitted this swatch, I prepared in advance, and this center stitch I made all gray every time, just so it would be easy for me to follow. And for the color work, as I came into my steek area here, I just kind of did a checkerboard pattern. So that way you don't want to have like a lot of long floats in the back to have to deal with. So if you do, you can do a stripe or a checkerboard pattern or whatever, but you do want to kind of continue some type of work along the edge there, along the steek. And so this area here that I prepared is the steek. And the word steek actually means to join or connect. So this little area here is joining or connecting the two sides of my cardigan. So if this were a cardigan, it's joining or connecting the cardigan. And then we're going to cut that open. And so we're going to cut the steek. So a lot of times you'll hear people talking about steeking. The actual cutting is not really the steeking. The piece that holds your piece together is the actual steeking, or is the steek. So I don't know if you have experience with needle felting, but I'm going to use this needle felting tool, and it has 5 needles in it. I don't know if you can see, the needles have little sharp kind of edges. They're not just pointy, they have little barbs along the edges. So there's a special needle. You can't just use a sewing needle, but you can get these at any craft shop pretty much. I'm sure Michael's has them online. And so what I'm going to do, all you do, it's very simple. You just, let me turn this on the side so you can kind of see. You just hold it like this, and then you just press this into it. So you're just pressing it into it, and I'm following that blue line that I marked out for myself. And so you'd want to lay it flat though. You wouldn't want to hold it up. And so what I'm doing is I'm doing that center blue line, and I'm going to do a stitch on each side of it as well. So I'm doing 3 stitches. And this changes your knitted fabric into felted fabric, or it's a fulling process. So you're making it into a felt. Any questions about this? It might be some, maybe you've never heard of needle felting before. So
I think everyone was very impressed when you just cut the other swatch with no preparation.
well, steeking with no preparation is probably the easiest way, but it's the scariest way. So I'm trying to hold this on an angle so you can see it, but when you do this, you would just lay it flat. You wouldn't hold it on an angle, probably.
Lillian wants to know, does this only work on 100% wool?
No. So that is a little known fact about needle felting. What I'm working with here is 100% acrylic. So I'm using the Hometown bonus bundle in gray, in Dallas gray, and in Tampa Spice. And these are available on michaels.com or lionbrand.com. Needle felting does work with acrylic and most other fibers. What it doesn't work well with is cotton or linen or like hemp. Plant fibers that are very stiff, it doesn't work as well with, but it still can work. If you have a very soft cotton, a very fluffy soft cotton, it works pretty good. But on a mercerized cotton, it's not going to work real well. You'll probably end up breaking your needles, but you can give it a try. If you're going to wet felt something, then wet felting, it has to be 100% animal fibers or wool. And so you don't want to overwork this, because if you overwork it, it presses the fibers out like this, and it can cause your work to splay, and you don't want to distort your fabric. So I've done this, and you can see, let me see if I can get a good view of that. I don't know if you can tell, but the stitches are very flat here, and they look a little bit different. And you'll see that if you ever do this in person. And if you look on the inside, I don't know if you see this line right here, this fuzzy bit. It's not really like that anywhere else as fuzzy. So you get this really fuzzy bit, which is the fibers that have been pushed through from the other side into it. So when you see that, you pretty much know you're good. So I can see that right there. And whenever you're going to cut a steek, when you're going to cut it open, I always recommend that you give yourself plenty of time so that when you cut it, you can fold it under and pin it, at least at that point. So it's going to secure it. Maybe if you don't have time to sew it, at least fold it over and pin it. So you wouldn't want to cut a steek and then just leave it for like the next week. So now I'm going to cut this one. It's real easy. You just follow your line. I wouldn't necessarily have even needed to put that blue line in, because I did keep that center stitch all gray, so I could just follow that up. So I've cut that open, and you can see I'm not having anything unravel. There's no problem with anything unraveling. So it's really not scary at all. And then you can just fold this. I've left a lot of space here, so you can just fold that under and sew it down, and move on to the next one. So I'll show you how to sew that down later. I want to kind of move on to some of these other steeks that are pretty fun. So this one I started already because it takes a little bit of time. I did half of it. And what you want to do, this is a crochet steek. So I'm securing the edge with a line of crochet. I did single crochet, but you probably would do a slip stitch would give you less of a bulk, but the single crochet shows up a little better for a demonstration. You can do anything. You can do whatever you want. And for this one, you do want to look at your stitches and determine what you're looking at. So I know that I started here and I did this design first. So this is my cast on edge and this is my bind off edge. So I created my stitches going in this direction. And we know that a knit stitch is in the shape of a V, like this. So we know that's what a knit stitch looks like. And if you look at something like this, where it's an upside down V, then that's not the knit stitch. That's half of one stitch and half of another stitch. That's what we're going to be looking for here, actually. So here is, sorry, here is my knit stitch right here. And I'm going to remove this green thread now because it's just kind of in the way. And what I've done on this side is that center bit that I'm going to cut, I've used one leg of that stitch. So here is one whole stitch right here. And I've got that blue yarn is incorporated into that to keep it from unraveling. And here is the stitch right beside it. And what I'm going to be working with is the left leg of this stitch and the right leg of this stitch. And when you look at that, it's not shaped like a V, it's shaped like an upside down V, or it's shaped like an A. I don't know, is that coming through? Can you see that? Any questions about that? That might be a little confusing. Doing all right? So if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and start with that. You do want to use a yarn that's a little bit smaller. So this was a super bulky yarn, and I'm using
We
a
had some
bulky
questions come in late, Darren.
Okay.
So the crochet, are you going into the middle of the knit stitch?
Yes, I'll demonstrate that right now. So here's my knit stitch right here. And this is the knit stitch right next to it. And what the easiest way to do this is to fold your work in half like this. So what you're doing is you're exposing the left leg of that stitch and the right leg of this stitch. And we're going to be going right through there. So that basically we are going through the center of both of these stitches. And what you want to see is this upside down V shape. If you see that upside down V shape, you know you've done it correct. So let's get started and then we'll see if there are any questions as we go. So what you want to do is we're going to protect our edge as well. So just kind of bring up a loop and secure it on that edge. And then nothing fancy, just kind of tie it in a little knot to just keep it there. Nothing special. And that can be removed later. Okay. So we're going to fold. Let's see if I'm in the right spot. Fold our work in half, so that we're just looking at those half of one stitch and half of the other stitch. And we're going to get started. Don't knit with your tail, or don't crochet with your tail. So, and once you get started, it's really easy to keep track of where you're going. So you just bring that through, bring it through like that. You can also just do a slip stitch. But so here's a good example right here. You can see really clearly because one stitch was red and one stitch is gray. So I'm using the left leg of the gray stitch and the right leg of the red stitch. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so if there are no questions, keep going. So in real life, the only steek I've ever done is the felted steek with the felting needles. That's my favorite. It's the easiest. I think it's the safest, and it takes the least amount of time or preparation. But the most traditional way to steek is the no preparation, like just cut it, because that's from the Shetland Islands. That's the way they do it there. Okay, so going through here. And you do kind of need a little crochet experience for this one. Okay, so keep going until you get to the very bottom. And then we also want to secure, oh, sorry. We also want to secure the bottom edge like we did the top. And then cut our working yarn. Pull that through. And that's what you're going to have. That's what it's going to look like. And if you pull this apart, you can see if you did it right. Let's hope that I did it right. So there shouldn't be any blue. So you can see these ladders or these bars that are going. That's the area we're going to be cutting. Okay. If you see any of your crochet work going across this, you would want to take it out and redo it because you don't want to cut your crochet work and make it all unravel. So you want to double check and just make sure none of your crochet work has gone into that. And you do want a very sharp scissor. I have these scissors. They're quite sharp. Some people like to use a smaller scissor with a nice pointy tip. Something like that would be very nice to use as well. You want to use a very, very sharp scissor. They're like fabric scissors because otherwise you'll run into problems. And it's probably not a good idea to just go ahead and take like a whole big cut like that. It probably is a smarter idea to just take little snips and maybe just cut a couple of bars at a time, just to make sure nothing's going to happen. I get impatient there, so I'd probably just give it a big cut, but it might be better. It might be wise to just there. And see, now you can see I've cut it open. Nothing has unraveled. There's no problem. Make sure you cut through all of your floats. So I had a float in the back that was really long, so just go ahead and cut that. And then you would fold this down and sew it down. Now, the nice thing about this, I would probably go ahead and leave this crocheted edge because it looks very nice and just sew right into that to sew it down. Just a basic whip stitch. And I'll do that towards the end. I want to make sure we get through everything else. So you just sew that down. And then the edge of your cardigan would be here. And then again, whatever kind of closure you're going to do, you can just go ahead and do that. You're ready. So if you don't have felting tools and you don't know how to crochet, here's another option. And there's lots of options. If you Google steeking, you can probably find even more options. So this time I've marked my center with a piece of gray. And you're just going to use a large-eyed blunt needle. I'm going to get a bigger one. And every yarn you're working with. Now, the first time I saw somebody doing a steek, they did their steek preparation work out here. And then they cut here and then they folded it under, which seems a little scary for me because then you're cutting these stitches and they're not really secure until back here. So I guess there's different ways, and I kind of included that in the handout. Sometimes you might want to leave extra space and then cut your, do your securing here. It's a personal choice, I would guess. So this one, I am going to demonstrate it that way just so that we can see. You want to just bring your needle up from the back. And we do want to secure our cast on edge. We don't want that to run. And I probably would recommend tying it in just a basic knot just to keep it from going. And then you want to bring your needle from underneath, from the inside of your work, and bring it up through that first stitch, like this. And then you go into the next stitch, but you're coming back towards the first stitch. That's why it's called backstitch. You're kind of always working backwards. and then you go to the next stitch and you work backwards. You don't want to pull it real tight because you don't want to cause your fabric to scrunch up, but you do want it snug. Okay, can you tell what I'm doing? Any questions about this?
We've got a general steeking question. Stephanie wants to know if you can only do steeking vertically or if you can go like diagonally as well.
Absolutely. You can. The first thing I'm going to say about that is you can do anything you want, and I encourage you to do stuff like that because it's not as traditional. Like you won't see a lot of instruction for that, but you can. I've done steeking on a horizontal and vertical. I'm kind of silly. I knitted a sweater and I didn't really want to put buttonholes, so I ended up steeking buttonholes after. And I actually steeked to make a pocket, like steek on it and then put a pocket in. So they were both horizontal. You could do, oops, I'm off the screen. You certainly could do diagonal. You just want to make, you might want to practice that on a swatch in advance and not practice that on your project. You just want to make sure everything is secure. The felted steek might be the best one for that because you know exactly everything is really secure. So I feel like this one's a little more time consuming. And you do want to do every stitch that you don't want to unravel, I would do. So I'm going to count that as every stitch.
I mean, you could have stitches unravel if you want the, what is that, the derelict look?
I don't know. I do not endorse that look. So this is a real common stitch, the backstitch. If you forget how to do it, you can just Google backstitch, and it's something that's done in sewing and embroidery. It's a very basic and handy stitch to have. And it can be very secure if you're seaming something. So on the bind off edge, I'm just kind of going to go through the bind off like right here. And then I'm going to bring my yarn over and then back down through and pull that a little snug because I don't want it to unravel. And I'm going to just kind of make a knot there. Okay, so you can cut your working yarn. And so that is the steek on that side. So I'm not going to do the other side. Of course, you would have to do both sides, but I'm trying to like not like you don't want to watch me do backstitch for the rest of your life. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this. And so you can see this center bit, I didn't do any preparation. I did my preparation over, and it's not unraveling. It's not like self-destructing. It's not spring-loaded. It's fine. You certainly wouldn't want to risk it, and you wouldn't want to like tempt fate and like not prepare it. So what I'm going to do now is I would fold this over and then sew that down with a felling stitch, which is just basically a whip stitch. And again, you'll just use a large-eyed blunt needle. I would recommend using whatever yarn you knit your sweater out of because then it's going to be very invisible. So you just want to secure your yarn to your work. So it's kind of like if you're weaving in the ends, you just kind of weave it in advance just so that it's give yourself a nice secure edge. And then fold that under. And so this is just a basic whip stitch, and you don't really want your stitches to show from the outside, so you're just kind of doing it lightly. So pick up that edge and then kind of pick up the edge there. So see how I'm picking up that stitch, kind of that edge stitch. I'm turning my raw edge under as I go, picking up that edge and then attaching it to the inside of my cardigan, if this were a cardigan. And you don't want to pull your stitches real tight because you don't want to distort your fabric or make it scrunch up. But this is just a whip stitch, and you'll hear tailors call it felling. Like you can use this on a hem or lots of different places, sometimes to conceal a seam. Any questions about that? So I've got that stitch that's loose. I'll go ahead and tighten. And as you're going, you kind of want to look at your stitches as you're going. And if they need to be tightened up, you don't want to be clear at the end and then realize it. So then I'm going to fold this under. If this were a proper cardigan and it were like 25 inches long, I would fold all of this under first and pin it. I would pin it with some or you could put clothespins on it or something, or just pin it with some T-pins or something to hold it. You don't want it to start unraveling as you're working. Okay, any questions about this felling stitch? Nope, we're good.
Didn't have a question on that. We had a couple general questions when you're securing the flaps that you've cut open. Should you hand sew them or can you machine sew them?
You can machine. So that's another technique. I'm not going to really cover much today, but I'll talk about it a little bit. If you prepare, like you've knitted this area in that you're going to cut, and so you could, so you're going to cut right here where we did our running stitch. Let's just say that's where we've marked to cut. You can run this on a sewing machine right here and sew that down, and it'll give you a very, very secure preparation, and it won't unravel. I'm not real good on a sewing machine. I do sew on a sewing machine that tends to get away from me sometimes. I do better with hand sewing. One problem you can face if you don't have the right kind of foot, if it presses this down too tight, then it can cause your fabric to splay out and distort. So you want to be careful of that. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think a walking foot is what you can use to help if you have fabric that's stretchy, like knitted fabric is very stretchy. That's something you'd have to research a little bit more. I'm not really qualified to talk much about that, but it is something you could definitely do. And I know a lot of people online, when I was researching this, were using sewing machines. So absolutely. If you're a seamstress, if you're good on your sewing machine and you have a lot of the different attachments, 100%, I think you should do it. But I'm not that good with a sewing machine. So any other questions about anything we've covered so far?
I was going to say another general question. I know that, and Kathleen says too, you can use this for steeking for like armhole and neckline openings. It's the same technique, right?
Yes, it's 100% the same technique. If you want to knit, again, if you knit it 100% in a tube, when you're doing your armhole shaping, you don't have to work on the back of the fabric then. You can always work on the right side of the fabric as you're knitting in the round. So it does make a very nice opportunity for that. And you can also steek the neck, which I did steek a neck on a crochet piece once recently, but I've never done steeking for a neck or the armholes. So depending on the style of sweater you're making, the pattern will give you the right instructions for preparing that. And then it might just say cut it open or steek it, and then you can choose whichever way you feel is the most secure.
Yeah. Michael had a good tip for sewing, to put a piece of paper underneath and then another one on top of the fabrics. And that way your fabric doesn't get caught up in the feed dogs in the sewing machine.
Okay, I'd be afraid I wasn't seeing what I'm sewing at that point, but I'm not good on a machine, so I can't say.
Yes, maybe try that. Okay, Kathleen clarified. How would you pick up the stitches after you've done the steek?
Okay. Alrighty, so let's take this one. So pretend we've sewn that down. I don't want to waste your life making you watch me do that. And use this yarn. You would use the same yarn that you made the sweater with. I'm just using this contrasting yarn for demonstration purposes. You don't want to pick up the stitch right here. That's the first stitch. You do want to also think about that edge, the cast on or the bind off edge. So try to squeeze one into the cast on edge as well. And I like to do it with a crochet hook. And you just reach through and pull up that stitch. And so each one of these will count as a stitch. And then you will transfer those to a knitting needle. So let me show you how to do it with a knitting needle. And when you're picking up stitches, you always pick up stitches from the right side. So anytime you're picking up stitches, it creates a seam on the other side. So you probably don't want the seam on the right side. So make sure you're going under both legs of that stitch. Wrap the yarn and bring it through. I think I split my yarn. Okay.
And that's right side, like the right side of the garment, not necessarily the right-handed side.
Not right or left.
It gets confusing.
I'm never sure about right or left anyway, but yeah, so you wouldn't want to pick up stitches on this side. So that's the wrong side, yeah. So, and that's just a general rule anytime you're picking up stitches. So can you see where I'm going through? You go through, it's almost like if you do crochet, that's kind of what the top of a crochet stitch looks like. And you're going right through there. You're picking up that V. You can see it's shaped like a V. Wrap your yarn and just pull it through. And this is something that takes a little patience. The problem is I'm picking up every stitch, but knit stitches are not square. Knit stitches are more rectangular shaped and they're taller than they are wide. So a group of knit stitches that are facing this way is not going to give you the same gauge as a group of stitches that are coming this direction, because this is your row gauge and this is your stitch gauge. And so now if you change the direction of your knitting, you've changed the row gauge and the stitch gauge, which are not the same. They're not going to match. So a general rule is when you're picking up for a button band is to pick up, I think it's 3. Is it 3 stitches or 2, Claire? Is it pick up 2 stitches and skip 1?
I've heard both, either pick up every 2 out of 3 or every 3 out of 4.
Okay. I always do, and you might have to take this out and redo it, which is the dangerous game to play. And you don't really know if it's wrong until you've knitted the button band. That's the dangerous part. So pick up 2 stitches. I think it's pick up 3 is what I normally do. Pick up 3 stitches and then skip 1. So I'm going to skip that one. But depending on the yarn you're using and your gauge and your technique, you might do it a little differently. And if you're really good at math, you could take your row gauge and your stitch gauge and do some kind of magic calculation and probably figure out exactly the right way to do it. And I am not good at math, so it's not going to happen for me. But I think
I was going to say, if you're following a pattern and they give you, a certain number of stitches to pick up for the button band, Usually what I do is I'll take the area that I'm picking up the stitches in and divide that either in half or quarters or thirds and mark it off with stitch markers.
Yes,
And then
good.
you know, okay, I only have 20 stitches to pick up in this area. And if you have to rip back and, you know, respace the stitches, it's not such a big deal.
Yeah. That's very, stitch markers are such a great help. And then again, you want to include, you probably do, I do, you want to include your cast off edge as well, because you want it to come clear to the edge, probably. Do not split your yarn. Okay. And so now you would be ready then to knit, and you're going to do whatever, stockinette stitch, seed stitch, whatever you want to do. But just at this point, just look at your work. And if I'm going to start knitting right here, then this is the wrong side. So make sure you're knitting accordingly to whatever stitch you're doing, you know, the right side and the wrong side. You just want to make sure you're knitting the correct side. Don't get confused and think this is the right side and put your button band on inside out. Not a good look. Any other questions? Picking up stitches, that looks pretty easy. Yeah. I would recommend doing that on circular needle, like a 40-inch circular, and then that way you're not going to have any stitches falling off the other end. Okay. Okay, any other questions about? So the last technique, and I discovered this on the internet. I've never done this in real life. I've done some practicing pieces here. When I was looking up some videos to prepare for class, I came across this one from Pearl Soho, and it was just such a clever idea. I just wanted to include it. This creates a knitted interfacing, which gives you a nice, very neat look. You do want to double check your gauge. I did this side with the same yarn that I knit the sweater with, the same size yarn, and you can see it forces it to be much larger. So you wouldn't want that. I did this one with one size smaller, and it's much better, but it's still a little bit too big. So you might want to either use a smaller yarn or maybe a smaller needle, so you can play around with your gauge. And again, I would definitely recommend, if you're going to do this, knit up a swatch with however you made your sweater and practice this in advance. And so this piece here is the swatch that I knitted. And it's knitted in a certain way. It's mostly stockinette stitch, but you do have some pearls. So there's a pattern in your handout how to knit this. And what happens is when you look on the inside, it creates a little area for you to work. So it creates this row of pearls here, one on each side, and that's what we're going to be working with. And then it creates this row of pearls on each side of the center where you're going to be cutting. So it gives you, it really marks out the place where you're going to cut. All right, so give me 1 second. To grab an extra pair of knitting needles. Okay, so what you're going to do here is you're going to work on this. On the inside of your work, you're going to work on this row of knit stitches, but when you made them on this side, they were purl stitches. So you create this row of purl stitches, which gives you this row of knit stitches on the inside. And you're going to pick up, and with this one, I'm using a worsted weight yarn. I wanted to see the difference in that. So you're going to pick up, again, you want to try to include your cast on. So you're going to pick up all of those knit stitches You're just going to go under each knit stitch and pick up each one. You can see kind of once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad. Okay, so I'm not going to make you watch me do that whole row. Any questions about that, picking up stitches? So what you do is you pick up stitches that entire row, and then I've already completed this side to make it a little faster. After you've picked up stitches on that entire row, you do want to knit stockinette stitch, and that's going to become the knitted interfacing. And you want to knit it about halfway. We're going to end up folding this in half. So you're going to end up knitting it about halfway in between what your stitch preparation area is. And so you can't really count your stitches for that because we're knitting in a different direction. So you do kind of measure it as you're going. And this was about halfway, and I felt that was pretty good. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this steek. I'm not going to finish the other side. Of course, you would have to do both sides. I don't want to waste your time doing that. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this steek from this side because I have this nice trench to work from. Or you could turn it inside out. Well, maybe I'll turn it inside out and do it, because if you had a big Fair Isle sweater, it might be easier to do it from that way. So if you look at it, I've got this row of knit stitches down the middle, and on each side I have my purls, and then I have a row of purls here, and you can see where I've picked up the stitches from the other side. So you might want to make sure whatever yarn you're using is a yarn that'll blend well with what you've knitted with. And so we're just going to go ahead and cut that right open. Oh, and here's one thing I want to make sure I stress this. When you're cutting your steek, be extra careful that you're only cutting one layer. You don't want to cut the back of your sweater too. I don't know if that's ever happened, but it just seems like a horrible mistake that could easily be made. So you want to make sure that you are only cutting one layer of the fabric. That would just be a mess.
I'm sure it's happened to at least one poor unfortunate soul.
Sure it has. That would be awful. All right. So I'm going to fold this in half. And I'm going to fold. Okay, so what we're doing, where's my working yarn? Yeah, I've never done this one, but it just seemed so fascinating to me. And you just fold it in half like this, and you're folding your cut edge, your raw edge is going to be folded inside, and you're going to pick up the stitch here on the edge of that, and then you're going to pick up the stitch off your needle from the interfacing that you knitted, and you're going to knit those together.
And what's this method called again, Darren?
They just called it a steek with knitted interfacing. And then take that off and pick up this stitch, and then the next stitch off of your other needle, and you're just knitting these two together. And then slide that off and just go one at a time. Any questions about how I'm doing this? And then as you go, just take your, you want to guide those raw edges to the inside of this. And I would probably do this section of it with whatever yarn I knitted my sweater with, because as you can see, these stitches are going to be a little visible, and you would want it to match. I just thought this was, it just gives you such a neat finished edge. I just wanted to kind of share it. What
So
do you
you're
think of this?
joining the two edges together, and then you've got a line of stitches. Do you come back later and bind that off?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm doing it wrong. Actually, thank you, Claire.
I wondered if this should be like a 3-needle bind off situation.
It's not really. Okay, so I'm not gonna, okay, I did it wrong. I actually did it wrong, but I'm gonna start doing it correctly and show you the difference. So I was just so nervous trying to get it done right that I didn't. So as you knit each stitch, you do want to bind off as you go. So this will be the right way to do it. So you knit those two together. And then bind that off. That's what I should have been doing all along. But I was so afraid I was going to do it wrong. I ended up doing it wrong. Because I didn't even know about this method until like a week ago. Okay, so you knit 2 stitches together and then bind off as you go. And if you forget to bind off as you go, like I was forgetting to bind off as I went, you could probably then just go along and bind off at like the next step. But this way it gives you such a nice, it's just finished. When you're done, you're pretty much done. Okay, and then just kind of guide that under, fold it in half and guide those loose ends under. Okay. Any questions about this? And you can find this video online if you Google it.
Everyone was very impressed, even when you were doing it wrong.
Well, you know what? I do things wrong. Sorry.
Yes. Hey, we all make mistakes, and that's how we learn.
But the inside, if once you do it, it looks like this. And you can see how that's a very, very neat edge. Then the last step would be, and I didn't do this because I was going to show you guys that it needed to be done. I trimmed off my edges to make it look neat, but you do need to sew this tube shut. So you would just then, with whatever yarn you knit your sweater with, go ahead and sew that shut. Top and the bottom will need to be sewn shut. And then at that point, you could, you have this nice edge right here that you could use to pick up for a button band or to sew a zipper in. So that one, I obviously need a little more practice on, but I think it's a nice idea. The felted one's my favorite. I'll probably always use the felted steek. I don't know how you guys feel about it. But that's pretty much everything, unless if you guys have any questions. Are there any questions?
While we wait for people to type, I'll remind everyone that we did record this class, so you can watch it tomorrow at michaels.com/classes. It'll also be on their YouTube channel. If you didn't get the handout, I'll put it in the chat now. Unfortunately, it seems like if you're joining Zoom from a mobile device like an iPad or a phone, you can't download the handouts from the chat. We'll try and fix that for the next one. If it's a thing we can fix, it might be a Zoom issue, but it should also be in your class confirmation email.
Okay, any questions? I'm trying to read the chat. I can't really see that far.
Everyone's very impressed with your bravery in cutting fabric.
It's my favorite thing. One time I knit a sleeve and it was measured wrong, and I did the sleeve like way too long, and I cut the sleeve in half and reknitted it. Like I cut the cuff off of it and just put the cuff on where it should have been. Like, it's not scary to cut your knitting. Just go ahead and cut it up. Just be careful.
And we do have some other upcoming classes too. If you accidentally cut a hole, join us next week, Monday, to learn how to repair hand knits.
Or if you like get a moth situation, or if you just through wearing, you end up wearing a hole in your knitted items.
Yeah, And then on November 23rd, we'll be teaching Intro to Cables. So if you want to learn how to make those beautiful rope cable designs. And then on November 30th, we'll be doing crewel embroidery.
Yeah, that one will be fun. Yeah. And then more in December, so stay tuned for that.
Yes. All right, I'm going to put the handout in the chat once more, just in case anybody else needs it.
Okay. All right, no final questions, last few. Oh, if you do come up with any questions, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok. Maybe Claire will put my screen name in. It's Mr. Woolly Bear, M-I-S-T-E-R, Woolly Bear. So Mr. is spelled out. So I think Claire will put that in the chat for us right there. And you can send me a direct message on Instagram, and I can usually answer them pretty quick. So if they're not too complicated. So. Okay, if that's no other questions, have a good night. Thanks, everyone.